we're really challenging how people think about safety and security from a nonviolent angle. And I think that's where I think the philosophy of nonviolence comes to its fruition. And we're really thinking of the interdependence. And I'm not trying to be safe from you, trying to eliminate you or trying to isolate you so that I feel safe, which is a little bit the traditional sort of paradigm of force protection. I either eliminate you so that you're not existing anymore and so you're not a threat to me, or I isolate you or isolate myself so that we are far from each other. And so in that sense, I am safe from you. And it's a little bit of a limited strategy. And what we're looking at and working towards is there's ways of being safe with each other by getting closer to you, even though you are scary and maybe you've done terrible things to me, but getting to know you and you getting to know me, and me going in there without carrying any weapons and saying, I am no threat to you. I am the one who's disarming first, and I come to you with a sense of vulnerability. Then there may be a chance that I can be safe with you. Of course, that is not so easy to do, I think. But that's ultimately when we're talking about philosophy of nonviolence. That's the direction that we're heading.
I'd like to introduce our audience to Huibert Oldenhuis. He is the Global Head of Programming at Nonviolent Peaceforce with over 20 years of experience in peacekeeping, working boots on the ground. Huibert has worked as an international observer and peace educational coordinator for Peace Brigades International in Indonesia, associate expert for the United Nations Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament in Nepal. And after joining Nonviolent Peaceforce in 2012, Huibert has served as an international protection officer in South Sudan, head of mission and program manager in Myanmar. And now Huibert is serving as the global head of programming for Nonviolent Peaceforce since 2021. A very long and impressive resume in keeping the peace in all places all around the world. Thank you for being here with us today, Huibert.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
As you know, we're currently organizing the peace issue, which is going to be published. The peace issue of Meditation Magazine is focusing mainly on nonviolent means for achieving peace in the world. And peace in the world is obviously a big goal, and we take it bit by bit and step by step. Huibert, I've listened to some of your interviews, and I know that you're very focused on doing what you can where you are. And I know that Nonviolent Peaceforce has a very tactical approach to bringing safety to civilians and peace in whatever regions are needed at the moment. I want to have a conversation with you today that spans between the philosophy of peace and Nonviolent Peaceforce's philosophy, and also tactics, effectiveness, and where these things can be applied and how they can be applied in a safe way. Yes. First, I'd just like to ask you a broad question about the philosophy of Nonviolent Peaceforce. Is nonviolence mainly about effectiveness, or is it about morality, or is it about something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it may start out as effectiveness. I don't think our staff, there's no moral obligation to assume a kind of a principled stance of embodying nonviolence in your life. But as a staff member of Nonviolent Peaceforce, you obviously need to make a commitment to during the duration of your contract. And that is on the job, but also it's a 24/7 thing. You can't, especially living in a conflict-affected community, you cannot drop your nonviolence in the evening and get involved in fistfights and then go back to your work the next day. So there is definitely a commitment to nonviolence that adheres to all staff. But I think the founders of NP definitely had a lot of deep conviction about nonviolence. And I think for staff, there's deeper and deeper layers of nonviolence that can be accessed. I think nonviolence is for Nonviolent Peaceforce more than, we have a methodology that's called unarmed civilian protection. And it's not just the absence of weapons. We really feel that nonviolence is not the opposite of violence, but is an antidote. It's more than not having weapons. And I think the more that our staff embodies that in their work, the more effective they are in doing that, even though it may initially come from a pure strategic conviction of civilians not having guns. I think when we're coming into a place of conflict, you have a culture of violence, and trying to thinking that you can use violent means in order to get to a non-violent society is a little bit of an illusion. So in that sense, what we're trying to bring in is a different way of thinking. And when it comes to safety and security, which is really our bread and butter, when it comes to Nonviolent Peaceforce, we're not an organization that focuses on civil disobedience or civil resistance, which is a part of nonviolence that I think most people are more familiar with. We're really sticking to the application of nonviolence in the context of safety and security. And at best, we're really challenging how people think about safety and security from a nonviolence angle. And I think that's where I think the philosophy of nonviolence comes to its fruition. And we're really thinking about the interdependence. And I'm not trying to be safe from you, trying to eliminate you or trying to isolate you so that I feel safe, which is a little bit the traditional sort of paradigm of force protection. I either eliminate you so that you're not existing anymore and so you're not a threat to me, or I isolate you or isolate myself so that we are far from each other. And so in that sense, I am safe from you. And it's a little bit of a limited strategy. And what we're looking at and working towards is there's ways of being safe with each other by getting closer to you, even though you are scary and maybe you've done terrible things to me, but getting to know you and you getting to know me, and me going in there without carrying any weapons and saying, I am no threat to you. I am the one who's disarming first, and I come to you with a sense of vulnerability. Then there may be a chance that I can be safe with you. Of course, that is not so easy to do, I think, but that's ultimately when we're talking about philosophy of nonviolence. That's the direction that we're heading. And of course, that's not so easy in big conflicts. We can talk more about that. But
what you're talking about is very much about the effectiveness, but it's also, there is a sort of, to me, like almost a spiritual component to it when you're talking about being safe with each other rather than from each other. I think that there's a real deep beauty in that, a spiritual beauty of togetherness rather than separateness. And with Meditation Magazine, we are constantly exploring this, coming to unity rather than the sense of separation. I believe that when I was talking to the executive director of NP, she had recommended you because you have your own mindfulness or meditation practice. Is that right? Do you have a mindfulness and meditation practice? And if so, how do you feel like that connects with this work?
Yeah, for me, it's an incredible combination, actually. I started with meditation and at the beginning of my career because I heard myself doing sort of trainings on nonviolent communication. I was like, are you doing this yourself? Am I even believable if I talk about these things in areas where there's conflict, especially for a person who grows up in Europe without any kind of real conflict around? You cannot be believable. And that was a bit of a crisis for myself. And I felt I need to go in and at least look at the own conflicts in my own mind. We all have our conflicts, and it's just a question of digging deeper. And I think that brought me to meditation and spiritual practice. And I think the deeper I go into that, the more it reveals itself, and the more I can see the parallels between doing sort of inner peace building work, the demons within my own mind, and the more I deal with my own fears, whatever they are, the more I can get a sense of like how people are dealing with fears from an armed actor or a perpetrator of violence. And maybe a very poor reflection of that, but I feel that the more I can do my own work, the more I am believable when I talk about nonviolence, because we're talking about nonviolence to people who have their families have been killed by armed forces. And so it is quite something to talk about nonviolence in that sense. And I think Yeah, so in that sense, my spiritual practice is a constant aid to my practice of unarmed civilian protection, and also vice versa. The practice of doing this work is also challenging you. Can you go deeper into this? Can you practice what you preach? Can you really see someone who is a human rights violator, perpetrator of violence? Can you see that person as redeemable? Can you see the tragic expression of unmet needs that drive this person to violence? And I think when I'm working with my own sort of hang-ups and my own demons in a meditation practice, and I see how difficult it is to change, to take certain habits that I have and getting rid of them, or becoming more loving and more kind and compassionate. And I've received all the love in the world, and it's still so difficult for me. That sort of really helps me when I'm in a context of violence where people have been steeped in violence. Everyone around them is encouraging them to be violent and to express themselves in hatred. And so then naturally, I think a sort of compassion comes forth from that. And I think that helps me to do my work better.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very deep answer about how meditation can show you the dark parts of your own self, and how this can give you the compassion for other people. And that is a very powerful aspect to it. I also see another aspect to the meditation interfacing with the nonviolent peace work that you're doing, where meditation is connecting you with the oneness of existence, or the unity of the universe, or things like that. And the interbeing, if you use Thich Nhat Hanh's words, the interdependence. And when you were talking about being safe with each other rather than from each other, it gave me that vibe, that feeling of connectedness, oneness, unity. Do you feel a connection between your own meditation practice and how that feels with connection and unity and interdependence and interbeing? And also with the nonviolent peace work, do you feel a connection there, or a synchrony there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the deeper I go into my spiritual practice, is in the Buddhist practice, the more I go deeper into the interdependence and the impermanence of the nature, the more I also see that as a reality, and seeing that applying nonviolence through Nonviolent Peaceforce, and seeing how the paradigm of force protection and violence is, in a way, in my opinion, a violation of, or a moving away from the way the world is. And I think the reality is one of interdependence. And in that sense, nonviolence becomes an alignment to the nature of reality, whereas violence becomes an infriction of that, and going against the grain. And I think for me, then, that our work on nonviolence becomes more meaningful in that sense. And I think the deeper we go into the practice of unarmed civilian protection and the relational aspect, because force protection is really using weapons, and you're relying on force to separate, to isolate. And unarmed civilian protection using nonviolence is a recognition of the interdependence, like I said before, and it is deeply relational. And so you're seeing the interdependence of those relationships within a community that is connected to armed actors. Some people are fighting by day, and at night or at day they are a pastor in a village, and at night they're part of an armed group. It's very messy, and it's very interconnected in that sense. And so you see the relational aspects of safety and security. And it's not like we're in a sort of, from a very mechanistic paradigm, it's the idea of, like, I can go into a community and I can fix something and I can take it out, and I'm leaving the sort of the community unchanged. And I think that's how the sort of violent paradigm is taking place. It's also, you see it in prisons. We're taking criminal elements from society and we're isolating them, and as if society is some sort of clockwork and not like an organism that is constantly changing. And what I like in transitional justice as well, or transformative justice, is it's a notion of crime is like a fault of the whole society, and it's a responsibility of the whole organism, of this interdependent connection. that has produced a crime, and it's a problem for all of us. And so they say, so not get out of here, but get in here. And so that's the same paradigm of using with safety and security. And we're seeing that now more and more when we're looking at climate change. It's like, if we're saying in Europe, we're going to build a big wall and the Amazon is burning and the rest of the world is burning, and we think we can be safe in a little bubble isolated from the rest of the world, we're in for a surprise, but we cannot maintain that. And so we're seeing that sort of by the paradigm of interdependence, we're seeing that confirmed with these global processes and challenges like climate change. And so that strengthens me in the practice of nonviolence and the belief in interdependence and the richness of it. I think we're also seeing in biology that the more interactions of an organism, the richer the product becomes. And it's not I'm giving something away and therefore I'm losing something. It's like the interconnections with different people. It makes the whole of the organism more rich and more diverse and more to flourishing. And so I think that's amazing. And so I keep being amazed by these things the deeper I go into it.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And I think that what you're talking about, creating this inter-peace and almost a kindred spirit, love, brotherhood type of thing within these communities that you're going into, rather than trying to keep them apart, you're putting them together, bringing them in rather than pushing them out. It sounds to some people, I think to military people or normal mainstream, I guess you could say, people who think of security in that way of keeping it out, it can sound like this hippy dippy like thing, like, oh yeah, peace and love, we're gonna make everyone brothers and holding hands and stuff. And I think it can sound like this hippy dippy thing, but the truth is, that sounds like that would very much lead to a much more stable peace in places where you're going in and getting people together rather than separating them apart. They're going to always crash back together at some point, or they may crash back together at some point. As soon as the gap is breached, as the security is breached, there's war again, there's a violence again. When you bring them together, there's no more gap to be crashed. There's no more security to be breached. Everything is good. It's actually healed rather than just a band-aid. It's actually a cure. I think that's a really beautiful thing. And one of the conflicts I've been exploring very deeply recently in our interviews is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Personally, as somebody of Jewish heritage, it's something that's very close to my heart. And to imagine, rather than separated peoples being secure from each other and afraid of each other, to imagine the peoples of that region being brothers and friends, to imagine there being that kind of peace in that region, it almost brings tears to my eyes. It would bring tears to my eyes if I was maybe doing a breathwork meditation or something like that. I would be crying about that right now. But I want to get more into specifics later in terms of resolving conflicts. Right now, I'm thinking about the tactics that you guys use on the ground for Nonviolent Peaceforce. Again, one of those kind of hippy dippy things where it's like, oh, hippies like to go and play in the field with flowers, but you guys are going out and going into war zones and putting down weapons in the face of people with actual weapons. And you're facing these things that most people, I think even military people, would be afraid to face, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. So I want to ask you, how do you go into these war zones and places where there are people with weapons that maybe sometimes are even aimed at you or people around you? How do you go into these with no weapons and do things to actually de-escalate the conflict while keeping yourselves and civilians around you safe?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a good question. And just downplay the sort of the aspect. Yes, there is courage in it. I think, but we're not going out and wandering off in a conflict zone, and waving a peace banner, so to speak. And I think, yes, what we talked about before was very elevated sort of ideals, and these are paired with very practical and very pragmatic kind of choices. And it comes from a very deep analysis on what's going on the ground, first of all, and really being aware what you can do and what you cannot do. For us, what is also very important, and it comes to sort of tactics and methods, but also the principles behind it really are, for example, our nonpartisanship. We're not taking sides for this group or the other group. We're not getting involved in solutions or advocating for specific solutions, like this party should be trialed and this other party is fault and this should happen. We're refraining from that kind of pointing fingers. And there is good work in human rights advocates who really put the finger where it hurts. And really show teeth towards perpetrators and calling that out. But it's not our business. We are really there to focus on safety and security, and our non-partisanship, our principle of not taking side, and our non-violence and our transparency. Like, we're really transparent about this is what we are and this is what we're doing. We want people to know where we're going, what we're doing. We don't want to be caught by surprise. We're really focusing on what do communities do and how can we support them, and they are the ones who often lead. They are the ones making decisions, and we're creating that space. So we're really staying within in our lane and knowing what that lane is. Just a very maybe practical example is an issue of crossfires situations. We've encountered that a lot in Myanmar and the Philippines before. We built relationships with maybe both actors on both sides, and they know who we are, they know what we're doing. And because of that relationship, we may be able to call upon them when there is a firefight. And maybe there are a group of farmers, maybe just went to their fields, got caught in a crossfire, wrong time, wrong place. And there have been instances that we have called upon both sides and saying, can you stop shooting for half an hour? Because there's a group of farmers there, one person got shot, needs to go to a hospital. Can we get that person out? And in some cases, we have been able to do that. Our local groups that we work with have been able to do that. And why? Because they know us, or they know the local group, because they know that we're not interfering with their conflict. We're not there to say, you should stop violence. We're not there to document the human rights violations that may be going on or pointing fingers. We're really staying in our lane and saying our business here is to get that person out and get that person to a hospital. And in a lot of those instances, sure, there's targeted violence where armed groups maybe very specifically target civilians. They may want to starve them or use rape as a weapon of war. That's a little bit different, but there's a lot of lower hanging fruit where people, where violence is avoidable. And we start there, and then we gradually move as maybe our power increases, our relationships get stronger. We may touch on more kind of sensitive issues. But the issue of crossfire, for example, oftentimes those armed groups, they don't have interest in shooting civilians. It gets back to them, and they're accused by communities. They don't want to display that image. And so the fact that we can get that person out sometimes is very much appreciated by both sides. And so when we are staying within our lane, our acceptance of both sides grows. And in some instances in the Philippines, where we were part of a ceasefire mechanism, and we knew both sides so well that they trusted us, and we facilitated a lot of dialogue, there were a lot of instances, for example, where maybe there's rumors that the other group is going to attack, and the armed group is calling us like, this is what we're hearing, we're getting ready for retaliation, we're going in. And so we may check it with the other side. It's just a misunderstanding. Nothing's going on. There's a training going on, and so there's a lot of shooting there, but it's an actual training. There's nothing going on. We may go into communities who may be ready to displace already, and making sure that people know that this is a rumor and that there's no reason to panic. And we may be able to avoid or prevent that retaliation from happening. In that sense, that armed group doesn't necessarily want to go to battle. They feel they need to. And so all to say is that those kind of instances, we are protected by our behavior, by our precision, by our analysis, by our relationship and acceptance of those armed groups. If we do not have that acceptance, it's a different story, and we cannot do that. If we have a lot of acceptance from those groups, we may even be able to go further in saying, you are recruiting children in your armed groups. What's about that? Can we talk about that? Because this is not in accordance to international humanitarian law. If we have that relationship, we may weigh in more. But that really depends on our level of acceptance and what the context looks like. Yeah, I think that's just one example, but I think our security, so it's very much linked to our programming, and the way we're doing that it's the same coin as our security. Yeah.
Yeah, so your security depends on your relationships with the combatants, essentially, that you have non-combative relationships with the combatants. They actually know you. They know that you're there for a good reason, and they're accepting then and happy that you're there in some cases. And that's what ensures your security, essentially.
Sure, but oftentimes they may not always be happy that we are there, or one side may not be happy that we're there. And yes, we have to be, in that sense, careful, and we have to see how far we can threat. In some instances, we may not be accepted by one side, and we may have to step back and work more with communities on self-protection. There may be instances of groups who are outlawed by governments, say it is illegal to engage with this armed group. We see them as a terrorist. So in that sense, our acceptance depends on maybe government getting in visas and permits and so forth. So we may not be able to engage with an armed group like that. There's still ways of engaging with their constituencies. There's still ways of showing what we're doing. But in some instances, we may need to focus on enhancing kind of the sort of self-protection of communities, rather than having a more kind of forward-leaning, proactive response that engages with perpetrators or with armed groups, having a more sort of backward-leaning response with communities where we're really focusing on, okay, tomorrow yesterday there was an attack, what happened? If that attack happens tomorrow again, what are we going to do? How can we organize ourselves in such a way that instead of 10 people getting killed, 9 people getting killed, in a very sort of practical way? In South Sudan, for example, we saw in the beginning of the civil war attacks with bomber jets or fighter jets. We cannot stop that. The community cannot stop that. But every time it happens, children were going into different directions. It would take days to find children back. We had to do a lot of tracing of those children to bring them back. So there was, by organizing people in that community and helping them to get organized, teachers in school maybe talking to children and saying, okay, next time something like that happens, we're all going to hide in the school, or we're all going to hide in that hill, or what have you. And in that sense, we're not necessarily engaging with kind of armed actors or fighters, or really working on the self-protection of communities.
So 2 questions about what you just said. First, when you're in that situation where the perpetrators or the armed actors that are attacking are not recognizing you or not wanting you to be there, and then you're working with these communities where there's just going to be fighter jets and bombs and things like that, how do you, as peacekeepers on the ground, how do you keep yourselves safe while doing that type of work? And obviously you're trying to keep the civilians safe, but you know that you're not going to be able to protect everybody. So you could protect yourselves.
Yes. And I think that's a very difficult dilemma, I think. And what we're often telling our staff is that you can only get shot one time. And so in that sense, we don't want to risk our lives and be reckless. So we're being very careful of going into specific places, and there might be places where we simply cannot go or cannot yet go, or we have to pull back, as heartbreaking that sometimes is for staff that has done so much work on it. Sometimes we have to take a step back, and that's just the reality of it. In Ukraine right now, our teams are there. This is heavy attack, and there's no way of stopping that. And so there's a very careful security management strategies where we're really calculating on, do we want to go to that area today? Because there's a high alert. And okay, if we really need to go, if it's really essential for us to go in, how many people is it essential to go in for? How long can we stay there? Can we have protective gear? In Ukraine, we did a lot of getting, for example, protective gear for local communities who went into the front lines of getting people evacuated from areas. And so in those circumstances, we just have to do a lot of analysis, making sure that we have the protection that we need to go in. And sometimes that means we can't do it today. And yeah.
Yeah. So the other question that I had about what you were talking about is you're talking about ensuring security for the people, and that your lane is to ensure security rather than to try to resolve the conflict by pointing fingers or things like that. However, you were earlier talking about the nonviolence being something that can resolve conflicts through security together rather than security from each other. And what I want to understand is, do you have any aspiration to help resolve conflicts? And if so, have any conflicts that you've seen been resolved, at least in part or in whole, through these types of means of nonviolence?
Yes, most of these are examples of more local conflicts rather than the very overarching national or regional level conflicts, so to speak. For example, instances in South Sudan of intercommunal violence that was going on for a long time. These are kind of very cyclical revenge killings and so forth. There have been quite a few examples of our teams bringing communities together, and that's a lot of work as well. And we are not necessarily trained mediators. Our focus is on safety and security. We may at some point, if those communities are open to it, find a local mediator who is willing to mediate between different communities. Sometimes these mediators themselves feel not secure to go there, and we may do the security assessment for them. We may provide protective accompaniment to them, so we bring them there. We may do sort of preparatory conversations with both sides. And when this sort of mediation event takes place, we may be there and we're holding a visible presence in that space and saying, okay, we're not necessarily there to solve the issue. We're not there maybe to lead the conversation or do the actual mediation. We're maybe there to hold the space. So in the event that people are looking at, mostly like people think about the mediation as one point in time. It's when people are sitting at the table or sitting around a tree or what have you. That's just the point where maybe we're just there and not doing very much. But then there's an agreement maybe being forged between the two groups or the two communities. Then our role is, okay, how can we follow that up? How can we monitor the implementation of that? How are you going to make sure that this holds? And I remember an incident in South Sudan that a month later there were two youth they killed someone or they stole some cattle and the whole conflict was back together. And so over a period of 9 months, there were like maybe 20 times where we had to bring the communities back together before the conflict kind of stopped. That cycle may stopped. Sometimes in sort of very personal disputes, the cycle stops sooner. But in these intercommunal issues, it is quite time consuming and time intensive. And sometimes years later, it may erupt again. And so we're seeing that there is a sense of resolution there. And so we're working also in that sense from a perspective of safety and security towards longer term resolution. But yeah, I think those examples that at least I am aware of are more examples on more kind of local levels rather than the big conflicts that sort of end up being in the news.
Yeah, what you're saying, it sounds like the smaller the conflict, the easier it is to resolve with this type of means, and the larger it is, the harder it is to resolve with this types of means. It sounds like what you're saying is an awesome phenomenon where your means of resolving it is by bringing people together, and then you use the word holding space. And I think that's really interesting because that's a word that we use in the meditation community, in the spiritual community, for being there for someone, being just sitting, just being peacefully without judgment, without telling them what to do. And when you think of peacekeeping forces, I think when I would think of peacekeeping forces, or most people would think of it, it's security. You got your gun on the side over here, and you're
Mm-hmm.
making sure that nobody steps out of line. But it sounds like what you're doing is this holding space where you're allowing all the people to be there together and bringing an energy of peace rather than an energy of conflict to the conversation, and allowing the people to come together in that energy of peace to be able to resolve things for themselves. So that sounds like a beautiful thing, and that you can do that on a small scale. But can this type of thing be implemented on a large scale in like those world conflicts that you mentioned, like Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Yemen, Syria, things like that? Can these things be implemented on a large scale for those types of conflicts?
Before going into that, I like just what you said about the meditation. And exactly, and I think it comes back to what we talked about in the beginning of the conversation. When you embody nonviolence and you believe in it, and you know that it works, holding that space becomes a different thing rather than when you're seeing people as evil or irredeemable. And I think it is then the presence, and not your physical presence, but also your spiritual presence in that sense, that influences how you hold that space, and also how you lean into discomfort, which is like every meditator, how difficult it is to sit with discomfort and relax into that ice, rest on that icy couch, as some people say. And I think that's what I also see within these conversations. I remember in Myanmar, like a meeting with local community members and the military, and they were shouting at them, and they were like feeling really intimidated, and the whole kind of the sense of inferiority that has been instilled for decades all of a sudden snapped back. And when we debriefed it, our own staff like, felt really uncomfortable. We need to do something. We need to. And for some of the community members, yeah, that was really uncomfortable. But also, this was good because we went through this, and now I think I can do this. And so there's sometimes that sense of, especially as an external actor holding that space, lots of uncomfortable things happen, and you may have to sit with that at that moment and not trying to fix everything that is wrong, because that's, I think, our Western mentality is often like, how can I straighten this out? And sometimes we have to hold that space and just let it be very uncomfortable. And sometimes at the right time, you can come in and be there, or step back for that matter. But just your question was more around the bigger picture, these large conflicts. I don't know. I think on the one hand, it's very easy to discard the use of nonviolence and the application of nonviolence in these bigger conflicts. And often we're getting into these big conversations like, oh, nonviolence doesn't work when, in Hitler, in the case of all those things. And it's very much of a zero-sum kind of game. And I often want to stay out of that sort of black and white kind of conversation and this battle of, does nonviolence work there or not? I think we need to try. We have to try. And it may start off small, but we have to build it out. I think nonviolence is maybe initially counterintuitive, and it requires creativity. And I think it is a bit of a martial art in that sense, where we're not living up to the best of our expectations. We're getting to the level of our training, and that's what rolls out of it. If we as a society are not investing in it, training in it, we're not going to be able to manifest it when the time is there. And I think that's also where the meditation comes back in. I think I see nonviolence also as a martial art, as muscle memory, because when someone shoves a gun in your face, if you're not have done the work beforehand, it's too late at that point. And then the flight and fight response comes in. And so nonviolence is really the middle way between that flight or fight response. And so I think it maybe it's not always applicable right now, but I think it's also easy then to discard it. And I think as a society, we have to do more to build that muscle memory and to train ourselves so that when conflicts do erupt, we're in a better place to apply it.
Yeah, you mentioned that you don't like to get involved in that conversation of violence to fix these big conflicts. Like Hitler, you mentioned, is a great example. It's the stereotypical example of somebody who's arguing that nonviolence doesn't always apply. It's actually something that for us with the peace issue, which is very much centered in nonviolence, it's a question that we have to explore. And maybe you don't have an opinion on it, but I just want to see maybe you have a personal thought about this, because one of these questions is basically when I talk to spiritual leaders, I talk to Sri Ravi Shankar the other day, the founder of Art of Living, and he has a very strong nonviolent stance. I talked to Amma. Amma has a very strong nonviolent stance, and others, Thich Nhat Hanh in the past, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, very strong nonviolent stances. And then when I talk about these things on social media or just in the magazine that's coming out, which is we'll see what the response is to that, but people always say Hitler as an example. Nonviolence wouldn't have stopped the Nazis. They had to go in with military force. They had to use nuclear weapons, which I'm not sure about that, but they needed to use this force. And so people argue that there is a need for violence in some situations. It's interesting. I've been using ChatGPT a lot. Have you ever used ChatGPT? Oh, it's like talking to a super intelligent artificial intelligence being. It's an interesting thing. But I asked ChatGPT about this question, and it said that we need to think about things in a nuanced way. We can apply nonviolence where it can be applied, but we also have to keep in mind that maybe there are situations where it won't work. And I think that's a pretty smart response. But the spiritual leaders that I talk to seem to have this very strong confidence that nonviolence can always work. Do you have a thought on this? Do you have this kind of confidence that nonviolence can always be applied, or do you feel like maybe there are situations that require other means?
I think that nonviolence can always be applied in a sense that I think there's no situation where there's no place for nonviolence. I think there have been initially in the beginning of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, there were groups who applied nonviolence. There is more research being done recently on the application of nonviolence within the context of jihadis. So in that sense, I'm always surprised about that as well. And I struggle with this question a lot. And I think I often tell our staff, it's good for us to struggle. We have to be open to struggle with it. If we're not sold on it, we have a duty to explore this further. So in that sense, I think there is a place for nonviolence, and we have to explore that space always. I feel at the same time, we often have not built up our muscle, and there may be a need to rely on force protection. And I think as nonviolent peacefulness, especially speaking, we are humble in that we're not there to tell communities in Ukraine you should not be using weapons to defend yourself. Who are we to tell people that? What our role is in Ukraine is, for example, is to find ways in which civilians can protect other civilians without the use of weapons. And that may be not from the Russians right now, but that may be other tensions. So in that sense, yeah, I think there is certainly in the situations where we are unprepared, where we have not done our homework of nonviolence, there may be spaces where we need to rely on force protection. Sometimes we ourselves in Nonviolent Peaceforce rely in certain situations on the evacuation of UN helicopters or what have you. So I don't want to be too idealistic about that. And I also think, and I think the Dalai Lama said something like that at some point as well, if there is a space, and I'm not sure what he exactly said, I shouldn't be quoting him in a wrong way, but the gist of it was that if you're going to use weapons, those who are wielding weapons, they should be trained in nonviolence. Because when you said using violence, in that sense, I would rather see us using force than violence. In that sense, can we use a force in terms of a very firm response in a way that a parent uses force to lead a child away from a situation that is not proper, or with a sense of compassion in a way? And I think that's very difficult to do when we're talking about militaries, of course. But I think someone said once, like, when we're holding someone accountable, the emphasis should be on holding. And ultimately, accountability can be an act of love. In a similar way, I think we should work more towards, and it's maybe my personal opinion, on the combination of it's not just violence or non-violence in that sense. Can we find within the use of force protection, can we use that with more precision? Can we combine it with non-violence? Because it's true, and I believe that as well, that every time we do use force or violence, it is bringing us further away from a non-violent society. And it is toxic to use a weapon, and it's toxic for yourself. And if we all want a non-violent society, and I think Gandhi was right in terms of the ends and the means, So it will bring us further away. And it's sometimes that's maybe our solution right now. And we have to take a step back from that. And we say we have to use force. And how can we do that in a way that is not vengeful, that is not coming from a sense of revenge or an emotion of hatred, rather with local precision that we're saying we're using force in that instance. Now, I also acknowledge that is very hard to do, because we're always saying a little bit of violence or a little bit of force. And then when it's stable, then we're going back to non-violence. And that point is never there. It's always an imaginary point in the future. So that's maybe not a very clear answer to your question, and an acknowledgement that I keep struggling with that question myself.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I don't know if we'll be able to resolve that by the time we print the magazine. Maybe it's an unanswerable question in a certain way. I don't know.
But we have to keep fighting with it. And I think that's also part of it. I think once we're letting ourselves, okay, I'm opting for nonviolence because I don't want to get my hands dirty in any way, or I'm just saying, yes, we need to get in for force, and that's the end of the matter. I think there is where we're going in the wrong direction. I think we always need to keep having this conversation and get to the least harmful way as possible.
Yeah, I liked your example of, if people are going to use force, if they are going to use weapons, they should be trained in nonviolence. And I think I heard this recently. It's not necessarily about the what you do, it's about how you do it. If there is a necessary military response or a necessary response with weapons, that the how matters very much at that point. The how is how you do it, whether if you're going in with revenge in mind, or if you're going in with like stopping the violence and protecting people in mind. It can be those military responses can look very different, and it can create very different effects. One of the things that you mentioned was that there were people that were trying to apply nonviolent strategies in Ukraine, and then also in the face of jihadism and jihadis. I think what's interesting about those two examples is that you're giving two examples of people or military actors or violent actors or whatever that aren't necessarily doing it for the same reason as maybe in the normal conflict where people are angry at each other. That it's more ideological. And when somebody's holding a very strong ideology, it can be difficult to resolve conflicts through emotional reconciliation or those types of things. So do you know, I'm not sure if you're aware or know about the means that those guys are using in Ukraine and in the face of the jihadis. How do you implement nonviolence in those circumstances? Do you know? Because I know that's not that's not what you're doing. You're just telling me about people that are doing that.
I think some of it also touches on the work that we're doing, and I think it's a similar kind of strategy, is that everyone is reliant on something. Everyone is, and it comes back to the interdependence ultimately. We are all depending on something and someone. We are not operating in isolation. And jihadis, those who firmly believe in violence, they are also dependent on the people around them, the means, wealth, and what we're seeing. And I think in the example of the jihadis, and I don't have a lot of knowledge about that example, but it's often the communities that are influencing those actors, and whether it's the mothers, the community members. This is also what we're seeing in some of our work when we were working with local groups who are then engaging with armed groups that sort of have set to protect them, but going astray. And they then point them at their responsibilities. They're holding up to their ideals that they were promoting. And often those are ideals of protecting their communities and so forth. And sometimes that can be very powerful when those communities are saying, you're saying that you're protecting us, but this is what we're seeing. And I think that is often where I see is a very powerful way that communities that are close to those people who are committing violence, especially when it comes to from an ideological perspective, there is maybe it's different with sort of crime syndicates or something like that. And there's also a way, I think, really using pressure and I think in the work of Nonviolent Peaceforce of unarmed civilian protection, there's also an element of, I am going with this human rights defender to this human rights investigation, and I'm going to inform the police who I know is related to the targeting and the threatening of this human rights defender. And I'm going to inform that police officer and saying, hey, I'm going to go with this human rights defender to this village. Is that okay? And I remember on one of those strips, the police was like, oh, you should be going there. This is not. But they are at least pretending in that instance that to be the responsible kind of duty bearer. And so they were like, in the end, okay, yes, you should go, or you should probably go. It's not right for your security. But in the end, we go, and immediately the person that we were accompanying at that point got a call, like a panicked call from the police. Oh, are you trying to internationalize this conflict? And I could see the pressure of that visit that it had on this police officer, that sort of saying, like, okay, if the international community is present with that human rights defender today, maybe today is not the right time to attack this person, because I don't want to get in trouble. Again, that may not work everywhere with a jihadist or who deliberately wants to target an international presence. So it really depends on the context. But I think there's also ways of putting pressure, sometimes subtle pressure, on people. Sometimes armed groups want to get a job as a peacekeeper, and therefore they need to have a clean record, or they want to be seen by their boss as doing the right thing. So there's lots of, sometimes they don't want to go to court. And there's lots of strings that can be pulled that sort of put pressure on those who firmly believe in violence, but cannot be persuaded from a moral or relational perspective.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, it remains a very difficult issue.
It is a difficult question. I don't know. I don't know how many of these questions will be resolved that we can resolve. I probably maybe it's like arrogant of us to think that we can, of me and Meditation Magazine, to think that we can resolve these questions, but we can at least explore them. And I think the exploration is the most important part of it, is for us to try to understand what we can do and what should be done. And through that exploration, eventually, over time, maybe centuries, our species will figure these things out. I have a couple more questions. Do you have another 10 minutes or so? One question that I have is, when we're interacting as Meditation Magazine with our audience and our community, whether it's on social media or through our print publications, there's one strain of people that tends to push back against the idea of peace through, you were using the word nonpartisan, I think earlier, that you weren't taking sides between the groups, that you were there to try to help resolve, well, not necessarily to help resolve, but to help bring peace and security, and maybe to resolve things through bringing people together. But there are those on social media and that read our magazine that don't believe that's the right thing to do, and that you, like you mentioned before, that you should point fingers at aggressors or perpetrators and things like that. And you mentioned that you think that there may be a place for that as well. So this is another question that we're exploring. Like, what is a good way to relate to conflicts for us as individuals that are maybe not in the conflict? Maybe we're here in the United States, or they're in Europe, or somewhere outside of the conflict region. How do we relate to these conflicts in the best way? Do we point fingers, or do we try to foster mutual understanding, try to understand both sides, and try to bring the sides together?
I think it also depends on your outlook on life and where your strengths are. I used to really admire human rights defenders and those who are like going in and or civil resistors who chained themselves to a fence and so forth. And I thought it was really brave, and I really admired that. Until the point that I realized that's not me. And I was more of a connector, or more of a peace builder, more of a bridge builder. And I found myself in that space more. Like I said before, also on an organizational level, there is great benefit of activism, or not partisan, who are decisively partisan, who are saying, I am going to stand here for these victims, and I'm going to hold those in power accountable. And I think it's incredibly important. And it's not necessarily everyone has to do that. And I think nowadays, with a climate of polarization, people feel like they have to take a stance one way or another. and almost are ashamed just of leaning into the complexity, standing in the middle of that, as if it's that sort of a stance of cowardice of sorts. And I think from an individual perspective, I think you have to find out, like, what kind of a person are you? Are you a person who is maybe connecting and like the peace builder type? Are you a person who more sees when something is wrong and is able to really go at the problem and put the finger where it hurts? And there may be other people who are really more kind of a humanitarians, who are like quick to help. Someone is in trouble on the street, and you have people who are right there and helping the person out. I don't think I'm not saying you cannot combine those things, but I think often there's a different kind of skills and different kind of disposition that people have. And I think it is a matter of finding out what is your way to contribute to a better society, and it doesn't have to be the same way as mine or yours.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very deep answer. One of the things that I've been noticing about the people that are taking that tact of pointing fingers or taking one side, taking a stance of one against the other, is in certain conflicts, this creates, like you said, a polarization where some people are on this side, some people are on this side, and the louder that they both get, the more they fight, and they create it. To me, it appears to be an expansion of the conflict from the region of the conflict to the whole world. And that this type of tact, sometimes at least, is not only expanding the conflict to the world, but also intensifying the conflict on the ground, because both sides feel emboldened and also enraged by what they hear from parties that are not involved, that are just taking one side or the other and then just arguing one-sidedly in a black and white kind of way. To me, it seems like that is just almost always problematic. But I can imagine certain circumstances where it's actually helpful. Just as an example, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it seems that, at least from what I can see in my own perspective, that it's a relatively one-sided kind of battle, of war, where it's somebody who has an ideology that this Ukraine should be part of Russia. One guy, and maybe some of his constituents, is trying to take over some other people's rights. But in other conflicts, just as an example, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, many people see that as a one-sided conflict, but I think that the fact that there are so many people that are so vociferously on one side or the other kind of indicates that maybe it's not so one-sided. Maybe there are valid feelings and reasons and things on both sides of that conflict. My question is, do you believe that there are one-sided conflicts, or do you believe that all conflicts are two-sided? And do you feel like that should influence how we relate to conflicts, whether we point fingers or whether we try to bring people together?
I think every conflict is two-sided, but they're not necessarily equally two-sided. I think there's always a perspective, it may be a diluted perspective, and there's always two stories, and there's always a sense of a gap of really understanding the person, the humanity, the interest and the needs of the other person. That doesn't mean that everything is the same. And I think there are clearly conflicts where they're very asymmetric, where there is a sort of a clear kind of perpetrator. So in that sense, I think it also maybe determines how you go into a conflict like that, but it doesn't mean that you all have to do the same. As long as it's, well, what is your strategy we can all do a lot of screaming into the void or have opinions about it, but this cacophony of opinions, is that really bringing this conflict closer to a resolution or not? And so I think for me, it's more of a question, whatever the situation is, what are you going to do, and how are you best placed to contribute to it? And that depends on, for me, and speaking from Nonviolent Peaceforce, we are starting always with the question, like, the people who are most hurt, those who are most affected, regardless of what the leadership has in mind. can we start with those who are most insecure, who are most targeted and threatened, regardless of what side they're from, even on the perpetrator side, who maybe 95% it's their fault or what have you. But it doesn't matter. We're starting with the people who are most targeted, and we're listening to their safety and security, and we can start like, how can we help them to feel more safe? And then in asymmetrical conflicts, it's often clear that the most affected people are often more on one side than another. As nonviolent peace force, we're not saying therefore we are excluding those who are targeted on the other side. No, they're equally welcome. It may be a very small percentage. And that's how we approach it as nonviolent peace force. I think if you're approaching it from different angles, you may come to a different answer.
Yeah, thank you. And my last question, and maybe this is something that we've talked about, but maybe you can give a sort of short takeaway for our audience. We as individuals tend to feel relatively powerless in the face of global conflicts. Is there anything that we can do as individuals that can help contribute to peace and reduce violence in our world?
Yeah, I think this may not be a very kind of satisfying answer, but I think it's really important to start where you are. I think we're having this overload of information, and it feels often we cannot impact all those very large issues. And I think that's very overpowering. And I think it's very depressing. And I think for me, at least, and also see that is for local communities that we work with in conflict affected areas, it's often like where I am, where am I today, and what can I do where I am? For example, when we're seeing in bad communities we were working in Myanmar with local communities, and we were doing a ceasefire work, and that included engaging with military actors and so forth. For some of those communities, like, I cannot do that. That's way beyond my pay grade. I'm not ready for that. And okay, you can go to a victim after the incident has already happened, and you can go there and hold their hands. You don't have to say anything. I can do that. And they start there. And we saw in meetings where they share their experiences, what have you done? What have you done? There were others who were maybe that, we engaged in a crossfire and engaged with both sides. And it became more familiar with, I can actually do more. I can do more than holding the victim's hand. And people started to build slowly this up, and I could see them flourish and grow. But it was the sort of paralysis that sort of kept them down in the beginning. And so I see this time and again in places where people have been battered and feel like there's nothing more that I can do. I can just better sit here in a corner and do nothing, and bring back that sort of sense of agency and say, what can you do? The person next to you, the person in your street, how do you behave when you go to the supermarket and engage with the cashier? Even there, I think for me, that's often what I come back to as well when I feel I'm getting overwhelmed by violence or by the scale of things. And I'm also recalling, I think it's a Buddhist prayer, and it goes something like, may I be loving and open and aware in this moment. And if I cannot do that, may I be kind. If I cannot be kind right now, may I be non-judgmental. And if I'm not able to be non-judgmental, may I not cause any harm. And if I not be able to cause any harm, may I at least cause the least possible harm. And I think for me, that's a reminder of sometimes we're high up and we are open-hearted, and sometimes we're not. And I think every day, every moment, we have a choice to move the needle closer to being love and open and aware in this moment. And I think there's no shame when we can't, because it's overwhelming and we're feeling a sense of anger. And let's not pretend that we're all of a sudden need to be open and warm and cuddly. And no, I think but I think it's again training that muscle memory and keep working at it. And coming back to the meditation, for me, that's a work in progress and a constant work that probably never stops. But it's worth it. And I think that's how we grow as a community.
Yeah. Thank you, Huibert. That's what you were just saying reminds me of this story of I don't know if it's a Buddhist story. It's just an old story of a little girl walking along the beach, picking up these stars, the sea stars. What do you call them? Starfish. that washed up on the beach and throwing them back into the ocean, just one after the other. And the whole beach is filled with these starfish. And some adult comes up to her and says, "What are you doing? You're never going to be able to throw all these starfish back in the ocean." And so it doesn't matter. And so she goes and picks up another one, throws it in the ocean, and said, "It mattered for that one." And what you're saying, just start where you are, be of peace and service and kindness where you are. It helps in some way. It helps the people that are here. It helps people that are really in front of you. And while we may not be able to stop a war in Europe or in the Middle East through these actions, it does help concretely the people that are here in front of you. And it has ripple effects that go out into the community. And if we have enough people doing these acts of kindness and ripple effects, that does, in fact, help in those, in even in a tiny way, in places in like far away in Europe and the Middle East. And the more people that are doing that around the world, the more of these ripples that we have around the world, the ripples of peace, the more it will create a peaceful world. And I really appreciate your time today and joining me, Huibert Oldenhuis, the Global Head of Programming for Nonviolent Peaceforce. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is going to be featured in the Meditation Magazine Peace issue, which is coming out in the summer. I'll send you one, Huibert, and for anybody else, you can find it in Whole Foods, Barnes& and Noble, Books A Million, Chapters in Indigo, places like that throughout most of North America and limited distribution in other countries around the world. So thank you so much, Huibert, once
Thank you
again.
for having me. Yeah,
And
pleasure.
yeah, just let me email me where you want me to send you a magazine and I'll send that over to you.
Wonderful.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.